Ezra Hart's right foot went numb sometime after dark, and he didn't notice right away. That was the danger. When the feeling left, pain usually followed, sharp and late. He shifted his weight on the frozen ground outside Trenton and felt the shoe borrowed, not his, creased the wrong way at the toe. It had belonged to a man who hadn't needed it anymore. Ezra hadn't asked his name. He had been a cooper in Connecticut for most of his life, or at least long enough to believe that a man could measure the world in hoops and staves, in things that fit because you made them fit. Barrels held if you cut the wood true. Shoes held if the leather was sound. Armies, it turned out, were different. They leaked men. They shed equipment. They left pieces of themselves behind on every road. Ezra had served for a year now, a full turning of seasons, enough time to forget what it felt like to wake without listening for a drum or a shouted order, enough time to stop thinking of himself as someone who would ever go home clean. The creek lay ahead of him, black and swollen, cutting the ground like a deep scar. Assunpink, they called it, a small thing on a map, a serious thing, when you stood in front of it with an enemy coming on. Ezra could hear them long before he saw them. Boots in the mud, iron on stone, the low, confident noise of men who believed the day belonged to them. The road behind Ezra had taken everything it could. He had lost his own shoes weeks earlier, somewhere near Princeton, in a dark retreat that never quite ended. He remembered the moment only because of how ordinary it was. No charge, no gunfire, just a stumble in the mud, a curse, and then cold where leather had been. By morning, the shoe was gone. By nightfall, so was the foot's feeling. Someone later pointed to a body and told him to take what he needed. Ezra did. The shoe was too big. Most things were. Now he stood on the south bank of the creek, musket resting against his shoulder, breath fogging the air, and watched men fall back across the bridge in ones and twos, then in clumps. Riflemen first, faces streaked with powder, coats torn on fences and doorways. They had been fighting all day, slowing the enemy, buying time with distance and nerve. Ezra hadn't seen much of that part. He had been further back with the guns hauling and setting and hauling again, his Cooper's hands raw from rope and frozen iron. The bridge was narrow, stone old, 16 feet. Someone had said earlier, as if numbers could tame it. Ezra watched a man slip near the crown and catch himself on the parapet. Another went down and stayed there until two others dragged him clear. The creek below moved fast, carrying bits of ice that knocked together like teeth. The shouting changed tone, closer now. The enemy had reached the town. Ezra heard a command, barked in a voice that didn't belong to anyone he knew. Then another. Then the sharp rip of muskets, fired too close together. Someone shouted to hold. Someone else shouted to fire. Ezra didn't know which voice mattered more, only that the gun beside him went off, and the recoil jolted his shoulder. Smoke drifted low and thick, mixing with the damp smell of the creek. His borrowed shoe slid again, just a little, and he set his stance wider, feeling the cold bite through the sole. The guns opened in earnest then. Ezra flinched as the first canister round went screaming overhead. He had helped wrap the wheels hours earlier, rags and scraps wound tight to quiet them for the night march that hadn't happened yet. Now the guns were loud enough to make the earth jump. Each blast shoved air against his chest, a physical thing, like being struck without being touched. Men in red surged onto the bridge. They came on fast, packed tight by the stone walls. Ezra saw a flash of bayonets, the long, bright triangles catching the last light. Someone near him laughed, a short bark that ended when the next volley fired. Ezra raised his musket again, aimed low as he'd been told, and fired into the mass. He didn't watch to see what happened. He was already biting the cartridge for the next load, hands working from habit more than thought. Ezra's foot ached now, a deep, cold pain that radiated up his leg. He shifted and felt the shoe rub wrong at the heel. He wondered, briefly and without much interest, whether the man who'd worn it before had felt this same ache, whether he'd cursed the leather, whether he'd thought of home. Darkness settled fully then, the kind that presses down rather than falls. Firing slowed, orders came quieter. The enemy pulled back, leaving shapes on the bridge that didn't move. Ezra leaned on his musket and breathed. The night smelled of burned powder and wet wool. Somewhere behind him, officers spoke in low voices. Somewhere ahead, across the creek, men groaned. He did not feel triumph, only a dull relief that his hand still worked, that his foot still answered when he told it to move. They did not sleep much. Fires burned bright along the ridge, fed high and careless, meant to be seen. Ezra sat close to one long enough to thaw the worst of the stiffness from his fingers, then stood again when told. He watched men dig, or pretend to dig, picks striking frozen ground, in a rhythm meant to carry. The noise felt wrong, too deliberate, but Ezra understood the point. He had sealed barrels with worse tricks. Sometime after midnight, the order came down the line, passed quietly, mouth to ear, pack up, move, no talking. Ezra bent and lifted, shoulder finding the familiar weight of rope and iron. The ground, which had been a sucking mess hours earlier, now rang underfoot. The freeze had come fast and hard, locking the mud into place. Wheels rolled instead of sank. Ezra took careful steps, mindful of the shoe of how a stumble could ripple backward through the column. They moved away from the creek, away from the fires, slipping into the dark on roads the enemy did not watch. Ezra heard the low creak of wagons, muffled by cloth, and the soft curses of men whose feet bled into rags, and nothing more. He felt his own foot warm slightly with the motion, pain sharpening into something manageable. He welcomed it. Pain meant blood still moved. As they marched, Ezra thought of barrels, of how you could tell when one was about to fail. The wood would complain first, a faint groan under pressure. Then a hoop would shift. If you were quick, you could save it, tighten here, replace there, ignore it, and the whole thing would burst, spilling everything it held. The army felt like that now, groaning, hoops loose, but still holding. He did not know which pieces of himself would be left on which road. He only knew how to walk, how to lift when told, how to keep the thing together a little longer. When the sound of guns rose behind them at dawn, different guns, farther north, Ezra did not stop. He set his foot down carefully, feeling the borrowed leather crease and hold, and moved on with the rest of the column, carrying what he could.